definitely a younger demographic here today, which I think is fairly natural. This is a new technology we're talking about here, and as the last speaker pointed out, a lot of people just don't even understand how this technologies work, and as he rightly pointed out, it's actually not that important that you actually understand how they work, as he pointed out, because even things like, I'll point out another one, email. Does anyone actually know how email works? It's pretty dang hard to figure out. TCP, IP, it goes through routers and all this sort of stuff. But pretty much everyone in the world today uses email, and no one says, well, I don't understand how it works, so therefore I'm not going to get into email. It's very similar when it comes to things like cryptocurrencies, but because it is fairly new and it is pretty cutting edge sort of a thing, a lot of the older people, unfortunately, are just not even going to look at it. And I think that's a big mistake on their part. In fact, I think the cryptos are probably the biggest thing that's happened to the gold market and will happen to the gold market in, I don't even know how long, decades, centuries. The reason is, as you'll see today, a lot of people here are talking about putting a lot of gold-backed cryptos onto blockchains, which will give everyone in the world the opportunity to easily purchase precious metals. For those of you who know about buying precious metals, it's not that easy. I don't know about in Perth. I was pretty impressed, actually. I had a long flight here, so I had time to look up what Perth is. And I was like, oh, it's a pretty new city, and it was basically based all on gold. And I said, as soon as I come to town, I see a Rio Tinto on top of the one of the skyscrapers, and I was like, oh, this is a very gold sort of focused place. That's awesome. But really, there hasn't been all that much growth in the market. Your average person, really, I don't know anyone outside of my circles. Like, if I go to a bar and I meet someone who's a friend of a friend, if I bring up gold, they're just blank stare. And you know, if you just try to even buy gold, me personally, as a person who's been in this market for 20 years, it's not that easy, especially with a lot of the government regulations in a lot of countries now. It's just not that easy just to go somewhere and just buy some gold. It's usually a bit of a process, and cryptos are going to make that a whole lot easier. So this is going to open up a market, a massive size, a retail market that just wasn't there before. And people will begin to realize over the coming years that this is probably one of the better ways to purchase gold. I'll get into a bit of why that will be, but that is actually the case. So it's a little bit sad that a lot of the gold people are very anti-crypto. Yep. They don't really fully realize that it is very complementary to crypto. It is not conflictatory. It is not a competition. And they both actually serve the same general purpose. In fact, if you go back 20, 30 years ago to gold conferences, or even 40 years ago, especially the 1970s, and you go and see some of the talks, those talks are going to be very anti-government, very anti-central bank, very much the same way that the crypto people today are, a lot of them are talking that way. So the gold people used to be that way. They realized that the problem with much of the world today is that it's based on fiat currencies and based on central banks, which are a tenet of communism. And due to those things, governments have been able to grow to unbelievable sizes to the point where they are really controlling so many things in the world today. And so many, of course, all wars are based on central banking. Without central banking, there really wouldn't be any wars. No major wars, because they'd actually have to extort or tax their own tax slaves to pay for those things. And people don't really like that. The US is still in Afghanistan. What is it now, about 18 years? Yeah. If everyone in the US was getting a check in the mail or a bill in the mail every month for their payment for the Afghan war or occupation, it's not really wars, you have to have two armies to have a war, but the US is occupying so many places with the massive military that spends more than every other country on earth. Massive military industrial complex. Ron Paul said that it's no coincidence that the 20th century was the century of total war. It was also the century of central banking. And it happened incredibly quickly after the founding of the Federal Reserve on basically Christmas Eve in 1913, that they put in the third central bank of the US, and this one has really stuck and really is still there, the Federal Reserve, unfortunately. And 1 year later, World War I broke out. And all these wars happened after that. And that's because they have the ability to inflate the money supply and the hidden tax, as even people like Henry Ford said back in the early 20th century. He said if people really understood how the monetary system works, there'd be a revolution by morning. And there really would. If actual people understood how this system works, they would get very, very upset. The good thing is that people are starting to wake up to what's actually going on. And it's thanks to things like the internet. Before the internet, the main way that we got most information was, well, we'd go to the government indoctrination camps called schools for 12 years. They'd give us all the propaganda about how these guys saved us and oh, they saved us, and now we live in this free country where for some reason half of our money is taken from us every year in this free country, and how great these great guys were hundreds of years ago to save us and all these sort of things. It's all propaganda, obviously, and the only other way that other people could get information was by turning on that little box in their house called a television. And it's called television programming for a reason. It is literally brainwashing. It is literally propaganda, mostly from the government through various means. All mainstream media is propaganda for the government. So before the internet, the only way that people could get access to any information, of course there was books, but even then, you wouldn't find a book by Murray Rothbard or Ludwig von Mises in your government public library. You'd find probably the Communist Manifesto, but you would never find anything close to any sort of free market ideas even then. So before the internet, which really came out in 1993, 94, it was very difficult for anyone to really know what was going on. It took people a while. I was surprised it took a little longer than I thought, but really by about 10 years ago, there was a major End the Fed movement in the US, and it was really led by Ron Paul. And you were seeing tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, even in Germany, they were having rallies to end the Fed, end central banking. People had finally realized, at least some people, not all people, obviously, but many people started to realize that this system is not a legitimate system. It's actually a very criminal system that is meant to impoverish everyone and enrich not just the 1%, but the 0.00001%, the real people who really control the central banks. And that's people like the Rothschilds and a number of other families that we don't even fully know their names exactly, but they've been behind the curtains, much like the Wizard of Oz, the movie, standing behind the curtain, pulling the levers now for quite a while. And because of that, they've been able to really destroy this world in many respects. People don't fully realize just how devious or nefarious central banking is. It is really a way to control people, and it's a way to keep them impoverished. Now, a lot of people might say today, and I've heard this a few times being here in Australia, that I was at lunch yesterday, and they're saying, oh, we're so lucky, we're so rich. Well, we'd actually be a lot richer without governments and central banks. They have destroyed most of what we would have today. We've gone through a period of amazing technological process, which is double-sided also, in terms of what its effects will be on humanity. Technology, like anything, every technology is exactly the same. It can be used to enslave people or it can be used to free people. And that's what we're going through with technology today. But just since the 1990s, I don't know about you guys, but the things that I do today, thanks to the internet, if I tried to do what I do in one day today with the internet, without it, I wouldn't be able to do most of the things, but even the things that I could do would take weeks or months. I'll book like 8 flights and 4 hotels in a couple minutes and talk to my employees around the world, and that stuff used to take like telephone calls and fax machines, and that brings us to mind Paul Krugman. So a lot of the central bankers and the Keynesian economists, they really want to keep this stuff down. So it was even Paul Krugman, who writes for the New York Times. He's that like sort of the homeless-looking guy who always looks a little confused, and he won a Nobel Peace Prize, which they basically give out like Cracker Jack toys nowadays to any sort of criminals. Barack Obama won the Nobel Peace Prize, didn't have one day of peace his whole presidency. This is the state of the world today. But they control these things. So they say, oh, these people are great. So Paul Krugman came out in 1998. This is well after the founding of the internet. I'd already started a company that was worth hundreds of millions of dollars on the internet, and he came out saying, at the end of the day, we'll find out that the internet has been no bigger change to day-to-day life than the fax machine. So that was what he said, and now what's he saying about Bitcoin? The exact same thing, that this is a bad thing or not going to do well or these sort of things. And it's really amazing how they will say all these things about cryptos when what they really are saying can be said times 1,000 times for fiat currencies. So for example, I was watching a video, it was really hard to watch, on YouTube just the other day, and it was Jim Rickards, who used to be with the CIA, I believe, so right there I would not trust him. And he said, wow, this cryptocurrency is, it's just used by drug dealers and terrorists. Yep. And things like that. Well, first of all, drug dealing is drugs or plants. The ability of people to transport and sell plants to voluntary people is not a crime. They've made it a crime, but it's not a crime. This is the war on drugs that's been going on since the 1970s. In fact, not many people even remember, but the first person who was the spokesperson for the war on drugs, which was started by Richard Nixon, who also took the US off the gold standard. So he was like, they're all bad, they're all terrible, they're all criminals. But he was like one of the top ones. He started the war on drugs. He took the gold backing away from the dollar. He faked the moon landings. I don't know if you know they faked but they totally did. And he was basically the main person for the top spokesperson for the war on drugs was Elvis Presley. He died a few years later of massive amounts of pharmaceuticals, which are actually the most dangerous drugs, by the way. So when they're saying that, well, this is used by drug dealers, first of all, it's not. I live in Mexico. I know a lot of the cartel people. They've got their houses full of US dollar bills. I told them to get on Bitcoin years ago, and they haven't really gotten around to it yet. They're kind of slow. But 99.99% of all drug trade is done with the US dollar. And here they are saying, well, the Bitcoin, it's only used by drug dealers. And they also say it's also used for arms sales and things like that. Who's the biggest arms seller in the world? It's the US government selling billions and billions and billions of bombs that eventually get dropped on little kids in places like Yemen and Syria. And they are talking about crypto like it's a bad thing. That is the true criminal currency. That is the true currency of terrorists, is fiat currencies. The US government, the CIA, that's the biggest terrorist organization in the world. They use US dollars for everything. You just see them all the time using pallets. Not to mention, they're also the biggest transporter of drugs. The CIA, this has been known for decades. The Clinton crime family, the Bush crime family, they're heavily involved in most of the transfer of major drugs, especially heroin, from Afghanistan, which they took over under the false pretenses of the false flag attack on 9/11. So they're talking about us like we're criminals. No. Yeah. They are the criminals, and they want to stop this because what they realize is, they're slowly realizing, and these people aren't actually incredibly smart. They're incredibly power hungry, and they will do anything to retain their power, and that includes a lot of murder and war and kidnapping, which is all the things the state does. But they aren't incredibly smart. Even with the internet, I was shocked. When it first came out in 1993, 94, when I first found out about it, I actually didn't have a lot of these political philosophies that I have now, nor a lot of knowledge about what was really going on in the world. But as soon as the internet came out, I said, this is going to end all wars. Now, it hasn't yet, but I sensed, because people will actually have access to real information, because I can't imagine anyone really wants to go to war with anyone else. Even World War I, World War II. These are all guys who are mostly drafted, so they were basically forced into going in and going to fight people on the other side of the world they didn't know anything about. Both sides were both backed by the Bush crime family, by the central bankers, Hitler, all these sort of things. These are all in line with the same people who are generally running the world today. People don't want to go to war, and all this mainstream media television programming with the news, and it's, oh, North Korea is going to attack us, and Iran's going to attack us, and that's because they're running out of countries to say they're going to attack them. The Soviet Union, of course, went away because communism destroys everything, and they eventually just got down to zero. So they actually all got together. It was people like Dick Cheney, Paul Wolfowitz, Donald Rumsfeld, and they said we have to create new enemies, because to them, that's very fascistic mentality, that they believe that we need enemies or else people will not have a good life. It's the weirdest, craziest idea I've ever heard in my life. But they actually, on 1 year to the day before 9/11, they came up and they said, we need a new Pearl Harbor. And they did that on 9/11. So these people are very nefarious and very evil. People like Henry Kissinger. My wife had to fill out a massive visa application to come here to Australia. And one of the questions was, have you ever conducted a genocide? And I checked with her, I double checked because I didn't know her. I've only known her for about 10 years. And turns out, no, she has not done a genocide. But I'm willing to bet that people like George Bush or Henry Kissinger just float right by those questions, even though they've actually done them. So they're very nefarious and evil, but they're not that smart. So they just caught on to the internet about 10, 15 years ago. It was when John Kerry came out and said that this little thing called the internet is making it hard to govern. They just started to realize it then. And that's when Bill Clinton and Hillary came out and said that we need to censor the internet. And that's going on today, and they've been continuing on with that. We have to shut things down. We've even seen things like, if you know Alex Jones of InfoWars, he puts out a lot of good information, but a lot of weird information as well, but they just cut him off. They're cutting off most people who are putting out any sort of alternative angle on things, mostly a free market angle for the most part. Because they're realizing that. Luckily, the internet was built in ways that you can get around most censorship, but your average person won't actually see it. So the way that they're setting it up right now is to make it so everyone's on Google, everyone's on Facebook, FBI book, and they will make sure that you don't see things they don't want you to see. And they will actually, they do all sorts of tests. They actually want to control your emotions. They want to control everything you do through what you're shown. So if you are using those things, you should at least be aware of it. I do use them, but I'm aware that how they use those sites and what they're doing with them. And so if you're at least aware of it, then you're not as easily controlled by it. But they're very slow on these things. They're just catching on to the internet being a problem now. And cryptocurrencies only really came out in 2009 with Bitcoin. And it was really, I only found out about it in 2011. Your average person probably didn't even hear about it until 2013, which was when the Cyprus bank bail-ins were, where they closed every bank in Cyprus, and on the weekend, and when they reopened, they had taken 50% of most people's money. It was called a bank bail-in, which is actually law in all countries, including Australia. I remember checking Australia, US, Canada, they all have bank bail-in clauses now, so the next financial crisis, and there will be one, and it will be soon. Maybe not this month, maybe not in the next year, but in the next couple of years for sure, if you just look at all the numbers, they'll be doing all these bank bail-ins. That's another reason to get outside of the banks. But they will, they're slow to catch on to it. So it's really just been the last couple of years that you're seeing central banks and governments starting to really realize this is a major threat to them. Even Barack Drone Bomber said while he was at some event, he was asked about Bitcoin, and he said, if everyone has Bitcoin, it's like everyone has a Swiss bank account in their pocket. It's like, yeah, you're right. It's actually way better than that. And then he went on to say, and he said this is his words, how are we going to do little simple things like tax enforcement if everyone has a Swiss bank account in their wallet? And I was like, that's right. And it will be excellent, and it's already starting. And so the cryptos are really incredibly important to any chance to removing a lot of these heinous systems that have been destroying humanity for the last 100 years and really bringing the world to a level of peace and prosperity. And of course, one of the most important things, and gold people understand this, to a society, to an economy, is money. Money is half of every single transaction, unless you do barter, and not many people do barter. It's half of every transaction that every single person does. We've all used it today. We'll use it every day in some form or another. So it's incredibly important to have sound money. And this is where the gold people really understood. And that's why they were very in favor of a gold standard, of gold being money. In fact, in the US Constitution, it's called con for a reason, it's a con game. They put in that money, they actually had some decent ideas back then. Didn't turn out, obviously. The US is now the biggest government in the history of the world and the biggest terrorist organization and the biggest extorter. They extort trillions of dollars every year from people who happen to live in that geographic region. But they, wow, lost my train of thought there. I was just saying something. Sound money, thank you very much. I get going and I kind of lose every now and then. Yeah, so it's really important to have sound money because as the gold bugs knew, if you don't have sound money, and you ask anyone in Venezuela right now, or anyone in Zimbabwe over the last 10 years, or really anyone who understands money, the inflation's everywhere. It's unbelievable. I went to they don't call them 7-Elevens here, but some sort of convenience store, and I bought a couple. I wanted some snacks, some like feel-good snacks that made me kind of feel like, comfortable, because I've been traveling a lot. And so I like salt and vinegar chips, and they got really good ones here in Australia, so I bought some of that. I bought a Coca-Cola. I know I don't drink it all the time. It's just, I drank it as a kid. It's sort of like my feel-good kind of, I want something that makes me feel kind of good. And a few other things, and it was like $40. And it's like, in Mexico, as one example, that would have been about $5 or less. So not to say that the Mexican peso hasn't inflated, but there's inflation hits in different areas in different ways. Of course, the real estate market in many areas has reinflated from the massive inflation done since 2008. We've actually had the largest amount of inflation in central banks across the world since 2008. They realized in 2008 that it was very close to the whole system falling apart and actually just going to zero. And they decided to move interest rates to basically 0%, which we've been pretty close to since then, which is absolutely unheard of in the history of the world, to have interest rates near 0% for 10 years. They try moving it up 0.25% every now and then. They're like, well, this might crash the whole system, 0.25%, because everything's so indebted nowadays. The massive amount of debt. And the reason everything's so indebted is because you have a money based on debt. When you have a money system, which is a fractional fiat reserve currency that is created out of debt, initially, you're going to have an incredibly indebted system as a whole. And what do we see today? Your average person can't buy a house without a mortgage. Mortgage is French, mort, death, gage, contract. It's a death contract. 40 years just to live somewhere now. And it didn't used to be that way. I'm sure a lot of people remember 50, 100 years ago, your parents would work a couple years, work really hard, and buy a house. Now it's nowhere near like that. Now no one even can afford cars anymore. Everyone's got a car lease now. You want to go to school, which is totally a sham and a scam and a waste of time, but if you want to, you will spend in the US hundreds of thousands of dollars and go into student loan debt, which is now actually one of the biggest debt bubbles in the world. Trillions of dollars for young people wasting their time getting Bachelor of Arts degrees, which are completely useless, that they can't even get a job at McDonald's, and now McDonald's is putting in touchscreens anyway, so this whole system is just all based on debt. And not a lot of people know this. The student loan debt in the US is the only debt that you can't expunge in a bankruptcy. So you have kids now who have been lied to. They've gone through 12 years of a child prison called government schools. They get out of there, they're told, well, the only way you're going to be successful is if you go for 4 more years of wasting your time, and this time pay about $100,000. They do, and you see it all. You can see all the memes on the internet, people holding up signs like, I'm $100,000 in debt, and I've got my bachelor in feminine studies, and I can't get a job. It's like, sad what these government schools have done to people. And then the mainstream media, television programming with the Kardashians and all that. It's just got everyone so dumbed down and so confused. But we really have so much debt in the world today, massive. It's just, how much debt is there? Even the US government. When Barack Drone Bomber came into his regime as president of the free world, one of the least free countries in the world, by the way, the total debt was $8 trillion. That was 2008. 10 years later, I actually have to look it up daily. It's going up so fast. It's over $21.5 trillion right now. That's nearly tripled in the last 10 years. No one's talking about this. If you just do the basic math, and I can't do it too well in my head because I also went to those government schools, but if you just say 10% of $21 trillion, that's $2 trillion per year that would go to interest payments alone. That's almost the entire tax extortion base of the US government. So if interest rates were allowed to rise to their natural level, and even people at the Federal Reserve and central banks say they have no idea what the natural level would be, and that's because they've confused the economy and the monetary system so much that no one has any idea what anything natural would be anymore. If it were to go to 10%, which is not a historically massive level, in the 1980s it actually went up to nearly 20% as they allowed the market to actually function for a few years. And so even 10% would bankrupt the US government immediately. And that's not to mention all the socialist insecurity, they call it social security, that it's already bankrupt. They also have Medicare, which mostly gives really poisonous chemicals to most people in the US and hides the symptoms of their problems and actually makes them sicker and sicker. That's the whole medical system, by the way. But a lot of people are on all these pills now. That's all bankrupt. Everything's bankrupt. The whole thing's bankrupt. This is a whole house of cards just waiting to come down. And no one seems to notice, and no one seems to care. And that's because it's not on the news, and it's not taught in the schools. If you go to any major university in the US, you'll be taught Keynesian economics and how debt is good and how we can just print money and it doesn't seem to really cause any problems, and it's better when we control it rather than the market. No one has any idea what's going to come. So this is why cryptos are so important, because we're very near the end of the system. Now, what's going to happen is anyone's guess, but it's either going to be a complete collapse scenario where all banks close, everything just basically shuts down, or it's going to be a hyperinflationary scenario where they continue to print money and they print more and more just to keep the system alive, which is what happens in most countries. At the end, they usually get to the point where they're running out of ways to keep the system going, and they'll just print more and more money. And so we'll go into hyperinflation. Either way, you're not going to want to have your money in a bank. Either the bank's going to close or the money that you have in the bank is not going to be worth anything in the next few years. So of course, this is where gold comes in and things like that, of course. But now we also have another option, and it's actually quite a far better option. I want to go through this for those of you who may not understand why cryptos are actually better form of money than even gold. Gold is, to me, a bit more of an asset, a bit more of a way to protect yourself from inflation and things like that. Actually trying to use gold on a day-to-day basis for transactions is not very easy. So let's go through the traits of money between gold, fiat currency, and cryptos. Now, I'll just give you a little hint. Cryptos have a green beside every single one of these questions. They are good on all of these. Gold and fiat are not green on all of them. So let's start with the first one. Fungibility, so the interchangeability of traits of money. When you're going to use money, of course, humans have used all kinds of things in the history of the world for money. There was seashells and sticks and all kinds of stuff. But it's really important that money is very interchangeable. So, for example, you wouldn't want to use wheat as money because not all wheat is exactly the same. So it's good when the thing is exactly the same. Of course, gold, that's no problem. It's always exactly gold, and you can test to make sure it's 100% gold. Fiat is actually interchangeable. All those dirty little notes with dead criminals printed on them, with cocaine all over them, and with like a pyramid with an all-seeing eye on the back of the US $1 bill that if you put a pentagram on it spells out Mason. Those are interchangeable as well. They'll become worthless, but they are interchangeable. So all three are pretty good on the interchangeability. Non-consumable, that's another pretty easy one. You don't want something that's heavily consumed. Now, of course, gold is used in various forms and various technologies and various things, but it's not the main role of gold in the world today. It's mostly used as a asset or kind of like a money. And of course, fiat is non-consumable. You can't eat your dollars. And this is what we always hear about the dollar people saying about cryptos. They're like, well, you can't eat gold, you can't eat Bitcoin. Yeah, you can't eat those dollars either, actually. If I had to choose one, I'd choose the gold. I actually heard you can eat gold a little bit. I saw some people putting gold on chicken wings or something. Seems like a bit of a waste, but actually I do. I take liquid gold. I hear that's really good for you. I also take liquid silver. I hear it's really good for you. But for the most part, it's not really, that's not the main purpose of gold and silver is to be consumed. Portability, here's an important one. Of course, fiat currencies are fairly portable, especially in the form of digital fiat currencies. So when they're in a bank, you can just go anywhere with your card and you can exchange. Of course, cryptos are very portable. You can use it anywhere and carry it anywhere. This is where gold's a little weaker because it's just heavy. If you want to be buying something fairly large, like a house or something, it's not that portable. Especially if you're trying to buy something on the other side of the world. If you wanted to buy a factory in China, sending that gold over is quite a bit harder than sending over some crypto. The next one is durability. Of course, gold is very durable, so we all know that. And of course, Bitcoin is very durable. We could get into some of the risks of cryptos, but in its core, it's durable. It doesn't fade away. You don't have Bitcoin, and a few years later you say, oh, my Bitcoin went bad. It's like, no, it's fine. Fiat currencies are actually the weakest on this. They have to replace them quite regularly because they just get worn out, those little pieces of paper. Highly divisible, this is of course important. Gold is moderate on this. You know, if you have a gold bar and you want to buy dinner, you can't. It's going to be very hard for you to cut out some of the gold from that bar. So it's not great when it comes to divisibility. Of course, Bitcoin is excellent when it comes to divisibility. Not a lot of people know this, but I hear this every now and then on the internet that people will say that, well, I want to buy a Bitcoin, but it's $6,000 right now and I don't have $6,000. Well, you don't have to buy an entire Bitcoin. Bitcoin goes to 8 decimals, which is less than a penny in today's currency. So you can buy less than a penny of Bitcoin. So it's incredibly divisible. And it can be changed to be more divisible if it ever needs to be at some later date. Secure. This is as far as cannot be counterfeited. Now, of course, there is some fake gold around. You have to be a little bit careful. But for the most part, if you know what you're doing, gold is pretty secure. You know that if you know what you're doing, you get the gold, you can check it, you know how to check it. That's pretty good. As far as counterfeiting, I don't know why more people don't do this. You can really print up US dollars on a printer. Yeah, that's no different than what the Federal Reserve does. But so it's very easy to counterfeit, and you hear this all the time in a lot of different countries. And of course, the central banks are like, well, we're going to come up with some solution. But they're the biggest counterfeiter of them all. So when it comes to cryptos, nothing is really less counterfeitable than things like Bitcoin. And that's one of the real benefits of it. When you have Bitcoin, you pretty much know you have it. The only risk is that you lose your password or you lose your keys. But your actual chance of being counterfeited is almost zero. There is some cryptos that's a little easier, but with Bitcoin, it really is basically impossible. So that's another benefit of cryptos. Easily transactable. Gold, again, here isn't that great. Gold coins, silver coins. Now, where the cryptos come in, that will make gold a lot more easy to transfer, and that will really change the game in the precious metals, in my opinion. Of course, Bitcoin's very easily transactable. On average, right now, you want to send $1 million worth of Bitcoin to someone, it'll take maybe 5 minutes. It could be faster, it could be a little slower, but probably not more than 15 minutes. And it'll cost less than $1 probably, or something along those lines. So that's pretty good compared to a bank, where if you want to transfer $1 million to someone in China, first of all, it's probably not going to go through unless you do this regularly. You're going to get a call from the bank, and they're going to ask you what you're doing with your money. And I always respond, what are you doing with your money? Why are you asking me about my money? Well, apparently it's not yours when it's at a bank, and I think a lot of people know that. And so you can get around a lot of those things just by using crypto. So in many ways, crypto is so much better. Of course, probably the most important thing for our money, I brought this up earlier, is scarcity, or a predictable supply. Gold and silver, as we know, has been fairly constant supply over the millennia, except for a few discoveries that happen every now and then. I believe, I'm no expert on exact gold inflation, but I think it's about 2% or less per year, which is kind of interesting because that's about what Bitcoin is inflating at right now. Bitcoin, of course, has to inflate in the early days, otherwise no one would have any Bitcoin, so it has to be created. But it's actually created with a hard limit of 21 million total Bitcoins that will be ever created. And that will actually take about 140 more years to be created. But the inflation of Bitcoin will go down further and further every year from here, and it's quite small even right now. And I could go into the reasons why a lot of people lose Bitcoin. And so because of that, the inflation is actually even less. Some people even say Bitcoin is deflating. But at the very best, it's very... you know what the supply is. And that's the most important thing when it comes to money. All these other things are really important, but that's the most important thing. If some guy in some boardroom, some communist central bank, they close the doors and all these bureau rats go in there and they come out and they announce to the world, we're printing up this much money. They actually don't even do that. They actually just announce that they're going to manipulate interest rates, which if you try to manipulate anything else in the markets, that's apparently sort of a crime, but they can manipulate interest rates all they want. And there's two things central banks do. They manipulate interest rates and they counterfeit money. They print up more and more money, and pretty much at a whim. We saw that in 2008, where they just decided to print up trillions of dollars and give it to all their banker friends to keep the banks afloat. So, the fiat currencies is so much worse than cryptos, and that's why cryptos are going to, in my opinion, do very incredibly well. It really could become used worldwide by everyone in everyday, day-to-day transactions. It's going to take a while, obviously. Just looking at the growth for me personally, since I found out about it in 2011, around $3, and there was only one place in the world you could buy Bitcoin on a market in 2011, and it was a place called Magic the Gathering trading card site in Japan, short for Mt. Gox, that you may have heard of. And this was a trading card site that some of the people there caught on to Bitcoin very early and said, why don't we put Bitcoin for trade on our site? And they did, and they ended up doing billions and billions of dollars worth of transactions and ended up losing a lot of it, and some sort of fraud or something got stolen, and some people are just getting some of their money back now, all these sort of things. But when I first found out about Bitcoin in 2011, I was like, well, where do I buy it? And someone said, well, there's really one place. There's a child trading card site in Japan. And I was like, I'm just going to wait and see. I wish I didn't. And I wish I bought and took it off that exchange. I would have done much better because it was around $3 at the time. But by the time Bitcoin hit around 100 and 150, more exchanges started popping up all over the place. It looked a lot more legitimate to me, so I started buying it at those times. So it's really just, when you look at the progress since then, I started speaking at, I believe I was at this conference when it was just a gold conference in 2011. I believe I brought up Bitcoin. I went on to speak at a few other gold conferences with one title of my speech was Bitcoin, Bullets, and Bullion, the Anarchist Toolkit to Surviving the Coming Collapse. And that was around 2012 or so Bitcoin was around $10. Back then, hardly anyone knew anything about it. There was really maybe a couple of people in the room who had even heard of it. Of course, 2013, some people started to hear about it. 2015, people really started to hear about it. And then last year, when Bitcoin really skyrocketed and hit nearly $20,000 last December, everyone was talking about it. Not everyone was using it, but they were starting to talk about it. So we're talking about just a few years here where it's gone from no one in the world knew anything about it to most people have at least heard of it now. The real big jump is going to be when it goes from most people have heard of it to most people start using it. And I just gave all the reasons why it's great to use as money. I don't understand why everyone would not use Bitcoin. I use it for so many things personally. All my staff get paid in crypto. I have at least 10 or 20 people in probably at least 10 different countries, really strange countries too, like Cambodia and all kinds of places. If I was gonna send them a bank wire transfer every month, that'd be just a nightmare. But I just pay them all in Bitcoin. It's beep, 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 beep. I don't even do it myself. I have a guy who does it. And simplest thing, doesn't cost anything. They're happy. You can, of course, get crypto-backed Visa and debit cards. There's so many of them out now. There's been some problems with a number of them. The government's trying to crack down on them. But my wallet, basically, I've got an actual Fiat card, which I use a lot because just like with, what is it, Gresham's Law? That you use the money that's of least value. So I'm just constantly trying to get rid of dollars and Australian dollars, everything, just get rid of them as fast as I can. So I do have a Fiat card, but I also have a gold money card, which is goldmoney.com, where I have some precious metals, and I can use my gold and silver to buy anything, pretty much anywhere, with going to just a bank machine or just paying in a store, just like anything else. So if you don't know about that, just go to $vigilante.com/goldmoney. I think you get some sort of discount if you use that URL, and you can get a card backed by precious metals. There's a bunch of others. There's one in Singapore that I know of called, I believe it's called gold silver. No, it's called silver bullion something. Yeah, silver bullion. Are they here? They should be here.
They should be here.
Yeah, they totally missed this. Yeah, that would have been really smart if they were here. Yeah, so there's a couple out there, so you can do that. And of course, there's a number of crypto ATM debit cards. So I've got a number of them. They've really been trying to shut them down in a number of countries. In Europe, anyone can use one called Wirex. So again, $vigilante.com/Wirex. I think you'll get a discount if you sign up there. And I've got one in my pocket right now. I use it quite often. And I also use direct as well. I'll give you one example that's happened to me twice in the last month. I travel a lot, and I try to use my Fiat credit card for most things because I want to get rid of dollars as fast as possible because they're going down in value very rapidly. And gold and cryptos are not, in my opinion, and are a much more sound form of money. So sometimes I'm trying to book like a business class ticket somewhere, and it'll be like, for me and my wife, it'll be like $11,000, but it's well worth it to not sit like this for 18 hours on a plane. But I'll go to like sites like Expedia, I'll try to use my Fiat card, and it'll say no. It'll either say no because I've gone over my limit, or it'll say no because, well, that's a big amount, your bank wants to call you, or all these sort of things. So there's been a few times just in the last month where I was kind of like screwed. I was in Copenhagen, Denmark, and I needed to go to Iceland and then back to Mexico. And they shut down my Fiat card. They had a whole bunch of questions. What are you doing in this country? What are you doing in that country? They're so curious. They're very, very nice. They're checking up on me and just want to know what I'm doing. And shutting off any access to all my funds. And so for a number of days, I didn't have that card. Luckily, I had Bitcoin. And there's a number of sites. I believe I used cheapair.com accepts cryptos. They accept Bitcoin, Litecoin, and Bitcoin Cash, and a number of others. And yeah, I was locked out. I was about to tell my wife, we're kind of stranded in Europe for a while until I can figure out how we can get out of here. But then I remembered, oh yeah, there's lots of sites that actually accept crypto. Cheapair.com's one. There's a number of others. And just went on and beep, beep, done. And so in so many ways, like if you're not using crypto, like you're limiting yourself to options massively. It's so easy to use. And look at the bank costs nowadays for a bank wire transfer. I don't know what it is here in Australia. And I don't know how it is here in Australia because I'm actually originally from a place called Canada, which I spell with a K, very socialist. And I have a bank account there, and I can't wire transfer money out electronically. So I can't go on the bank website, any bank in Canada. None of them do it because they've got actually a monopoly on the banks there. They only allow about 5 banks, real free market. And because of that, the banks never really progress at all. It's very communist, socialist style. It's all gray, and their websites are horrible. And all the people who work there want to kill themselves and all that kind of stuff because they're just like, oh, this is terrible. And I can't go onto my Canadian bank website and transfer money. I have to actually go to Canada and walk into a branch and sign some things. I don't know how this changes a whole bunch. And then they will maybe transfer it, and they'll probably have a bunch of questions and want to check why I'm doing it and all that kind of stuff. So I don't know if that's like that here in Australia, but if it is, and if you're not onto crypto, that's the way to go. And a lot of people out there might say, yeah, but I don't know a lot of people who accept crypto. Well, talk to them. Spend a couple minutes. If you have a landlord, for example. I do this all the time. So if you have a landlord and you're paying $1,000 a month rent, you could go up to them and say, hey, I could pay you in crypto. It'd just be a beep. It'd just go beep. You'd have it. And, it's kind of a nice side benefit is if you don't want to, you probably don't have to declare that income to the government mafia system. And a lot of people's eyes usually go like this. And, it's funny because in Mexico where I live, so many people are so anti-government. That's why I live there. And everyone, if you even bring up government, everyone just says criminals. Let's go criminals. And if you bring up taxes, they're like, that's theft. They're stealing from us. And they're right. Taxation is theft. But if I try to pay anyone there, and I have like a lawyer for certain things, I've got a conference there every year called Anarchapulco that Carrie's a big fan of and attended last year. If you're into free market stuff, definitely check it out. And so I've got lawyers and stuff, or I have to pay doctors stuff for sometimes or whatever. All of them want cash. They will never ask for payment in a form of a bank because they don't want to declare it. And in fact, if you go and buy property in Mexico, it's pretty amazing. You could buy $1 million house and you go to the notary or the lawyer to conclude the transaction of the sale, and it'll say right there on the contract that the house is worth like $5,000. And everyone's like, yeah, sounds right, yep, good. So you get around capital gains taxes and all this. Everyone's cool with that. Now, I know a lot of people in Australia seem really okay with being slaves for whatever reason. Maybe it's that whole prison colony thing, I don't know, I'm just joking. But if some people are really open to it. So that's really a way you can just go to people and just say, hey, I can pay you this way. And if they go, I don't know what that is, spend a couple minutes. It'll really help change the world. Imagine if, I've heard numbers like there's about 10 million people who have Bitcoin or something like that, or have used Bitcoin. If just every single one of them told 2 people every year the power of exponential math, it would probably be the whole year would be using Bitcoin within, the whole world would be using Bitcoin within 3 or 4 years, or 6 or 7 years. And that would just dramatically change the world. All these banks would go away, all these central banks would go away, all the wars would stop, The governments would have to downsize to actually reasonable levels where they're really not doing much, which is the best case scenario, and because they wouldn't have the benefit of the central bank money printing anymore. So that's one of the things that I would advise if you are using the cryptos. Just, with everyone you're dealing with, just try to get them into it. And you'll be amazed. Like, a lot of people will be really like, wow, thank you for telling me that. Of course, me personally, I was telling people back that in 2011. So a lot of people are still to this day, thank you so much for telling me about Bitcoin, because it was around $3 then, and they held on to some of it. And Bitcoin, talking about where it could go, it really could go much, much higher from here. We've been in a very strong bear market now since last December. The total crypto markets are down about 80 to 90%. That's a pretty good time to be buying. And I have to say, I was advising people to sell last December and January. So we knew this was going to happen. It went up way too high, way too fast, which is very normal in markets. But if you haven't started to get into cryptos, now is a pretty good time. It could go a little lower. It could go 30% lower. Maybe even 50 for a panic sell. If some crazy stuff happens, like the entire financial system starts to crash, everyone will just be panicking, and that will happen. But it's a pretty good time to be getting into crypto. And it's also a great time to be getting into the precious metals. On an inflation-adjusted basis, gold and silver are basically at 50-year lows right now, which is unbelievable. People in 10 or 20 years from now will look back and they won't believe that the two things that could really save people from this coming crisis and collapse that's going to happen were so cheap just days or weeks, months or years beforehand. And how few people had even figured out what's really going on. And that's on purpose. They control the media just like everything else. And if you go to the US, and I've talked about this a few times, Mark Dice has some videos on the internet on YouTube, and he went around in California and he had a chocolate bar, like a Kit Kat bar, and he had like a 10-ounce silver bar, and he was asking people which one they'd like. He was going to give them one. Everyone took the chocolate bar.
You showed that video yesterday.
Oh, you did, yeah. And this is what I see a lot in the US. It's not as much in places like China or India, obviously, but in a lot of the Western countries, especially the US, it's just been wiped from their minds. It just doesn't even exist through the brainwashing of the schools. They never hear about gold in school. When do you ever hear about it? They never hear about it on the media. If anything, they hear it's a barbaric relic or all sorts of propaganda. When in fact, gold's actually been the top performing assets over the last 20 years. When you compare gold to stocks or bonds, gold in the 20 years annualized return is up 7.8% per year. Stocks are about 7.2%, bonds are around 6%. So if the world was normal, most people would be like, wow, this has been amazing. Gold has been in the biggest bull market. We're so happy about this. I'm going to buy more, et cetera, et cetera. But no. And if they did polls of investment advisors in the US what do you recommend, and would you ever recommend gold? I think I saw like 10 or 20 of them. Every single person said, no, I would never, ever touch gold. It's been the best performing asset over the last 20 years, and they consider it like disgusting to even think about. That's amazing. And of course, they've got clients who they're telling them what to do, and they're obviously not telling them to buy gold. So most people don't own it. And this is a huge opportunity, I think. Over the next few years, and our price target is over 3 to 5 years, gold 5,000, silver 100. I think that's very, very conservative because I think we're going to see a massive collapse happening as soon as, even possibly this month. I've been looking at October of this year. Most they plan all crashes. The Great Depression crash was done on purpose. So after they founded the Federal Reserve in 1913, they decided, the people behind the central banks know how it all works. So they said, okay, let's pump everything up, let's print tons of money, get the stock market to go to amazing highs. That was the 1920s. And then they said, and there's just a few people, it's people like JP Morgan and people like that, just got together in places like Jekyll Island and said, okay, on this day, and they usually do pick a day, and they said, we're going to just withdraw the money supply, and it will crash everything, and we're already sold out of everything. We'll buy everything at pennies on the dollar. This is what they do every time. Every single crash is orchestrated, and they're ready for it, and they know because they're the ones who pulled the rug out from underneath the system, and the rug is money creation. As soon as they slow down money creation, because of all the debt and all the things that need that money printing to survive, as I think it was Warren Buffett said, when the tide goes out, you find out who's swimming naked. And that's exactly the case. So the tide is money creation. It comes in, and everyone's like, oh, this is great. Everyone seems to have money. Everything's good. And the tide goes out. It's like, oh, all the things I thought were real aren't real. But they know it, so they will actually do these things. So they usually do it in October. That's why I say this month could happen. I'm not saying for sure it will happen. I really don't know. But it really could be this month. There's so many things lining up for it. The actual money supply creation of the Federal Reserve has been going down dramatically over the last year. We're getting close to, I believe, inversion in the T-bond there. These are all classic signs of a coming crash, a collapse. And this is going to be bigger than anything we've ever seen, because everything has gone doubled, tripled in size since 2008 in the last 10 years, since the last financial crisis. So when this one comes down, this will be remembered for a long time. The Great Depression will be forgotten about after this one. But if you have hard assets, if you, as I mentioned before, bullion, Bitcoin, and bullets, get ready. But it doesn't have to be all that negative. Here's the thing, and this is what I've been trying to do for the last 10 years. If enough people know this is coming, then it will not be that bad. For example, in Greece, I said a couple years ago, I said everyone in Greece should right now get into Bitcoin. They're going to start closing the banks. I knew this was coming. If you know, and it's very basic. If you understand how it all works, it's very basic. I didn't have one response from anyone in Greece saying they did it. And then they closed the banks, and everyone started lining up outside the bank. I'm like, you're doing it wrong. Don't wait until the bank closes and then line up. Line up before it closes, take out your money before it closes. Most people just don't see it because they're hypnotized by the media. And the media is not going to tell you a thing. If you watch CNBC, when do they talk about any of this stuff? Never. And they won't. And that's their whole role, is to make sure everyone gets killed in this next collapse. That's what they want. But the more that we can spread this information, the more that there'll be people prepared for it. And the more people who are prepared for it, the less bad it will be. And if we can just really move on from this crash and move into a free market without much government or central banks, and people go to things like precious metals and cryptos, we'll have a world of peace and prosperity like we've never known it. Just look at any place. I was just in Hong Kong, and my wife was very amazed by Hong Kong. She's from Mexico, and she had never seen anything like it. And I was trying to explain to her, I'm like, this is like pretty close to capitalism. This is pretty close to free markets here. And you won't believe what it's like. And we stayed in a hotel that's 120 stories high, the Ritz-Carlton, and it's got the Tesla charging cables at the bottom, and the elevators are going a million miles an hour, and everything's perfect. And not just at that hotel, but that's the whole city kind of runs that way because it's very free market. You look at a place like Singapore. I think it was 50 years ago. It was just a fishing village. You look at Dubai. I don't know how many years ago, but I don't think it was much more than 20, 30 years ago. There was nothing there but desert. Now there's indoor ski parks and all this kind of stuff. That's what happens when you have freedom. Things can be built very quickly once the government and the central banks get out of the way. Literally in a couple of years, everything could be totally fine. We could be way better than we've ever been. But only if people understand why this crash is happening and are prepared for it, will we have that chance. Because what they're going to do when this happens is Donald Trump's going to walk up and he's going to tell people how he's going to save them with his 666 sign over and over and over again, hypnotizing. It's all hypnotism. And, I'm the best and I will save all of you. And, it was the Chinese. It was the Chinese who did this. And a lot of people are going to fall for it, and they're going to fall back into the same things. And they're going to fall back into wanting more government. They're going to fall back into whatever the new fiat currency is, which will probably be digital this time, and will be trackable, and will put people into slavery, unlike anything we've ever known it. That could happen, or if enough people understand what's going on, we could go to a world of peace and prosperity like we've never known it. And we really do have that chance. And so for any of you guys who are here, and this is your first sort of crypto-related event, talk to some of the people here. Nothing makes me more excited and happy than going to a crypto event, because it's mostly 20-year-old kids, sometimes 25. Their eyes are giant, and they're like, we're going to fix this world. We're going to get rid of central banks. We're going to get rid of governments. And they mean it. And there's literally hundreds of thousands of them now. And that's actually, a lot of them come to our conference in Acapulco every year in Mexico. So, one of the things I notice about the gold people, I think they're getting a little tired. It's been a tough 100 years. It really has. When they confiscated gold in the land of the free in 1933, and you couldn't even own it in the US for 40 years. And then once you could, they took away the gold backing away from the dollar, and they're like, oh, we're losing. And they add taxes and all kinds of, make it very hard, and you have to fill out all kinds of paperwork to buy gold. And I really get the sense that a lot of precious metals people are getting just really tired, and rightfully so. It's been a long, hard fight. You guys did really well. We're going to take it from here with the cryptos, and we got this. Thank you very much.